today or if it's going to shut us off again. It's quite frustrating that I can't, actually do anything, I'm having a heck of a time here, trying to get it to work. So, let's see if it cuts us off after 10, 15 minutes, shall we? Again, we're at the end of chapter 4, because remember, day before yesterday, it cut me off. So, it's there, but it's not there. So, I want to kind of overlap it so that you can hear the entire ending before it shuts. I threw it up on YouTube. Yesterday, we know the letter went out, so we're waiting to see what we hear back. And we're going to see if we can get through part 20 today. So, let's find out, shall we? All right, part 3, end of chapter 4, part 5. Mary took 2 large, lunging strides, and then the cop. She couldn't stop thinking of it as the cop, only now wearing a wig, falsies, grabbed her by the shoulder, almost tearing one arm off her shirt as it whirled Mary around. "Let go," Mary began, and then the Ellen thing clipped her on the point of the chin, a crisp and elementary blow that put out the lights. It caught Mary under the arms on her way down and pulled her close. When it felt Mary's breath on Ellen's skin, the faint anxiety which had been on Ellen's face cleared. Gosh, I love that song. Oh, the dawn is breaking, it's early morn. The taxi driver's blowing his horn. Already, I'm so lonesome I could cry. That's the song it was singing. It said, and slung Mary over her shoulder like a sack of grain. It turns me all gushy inside. Talk. Yay! She disappeared around the corner with her burden. 5 minutes later, Collie Entrogen's dusty caprice was once more on its way out to the china pit. Headlights cutting through the swirls of sand driven by the dying wind, and as it drove past Harvey's small engine repair and the bodega beyond it, a thin blue-white sickle of moon appeared in the sky overhead. So there's the end of chapter 4, which will continue from part 19 when I didn't get a chance to, say goodbye. So let's see if we can get into chapter 5. We get about 10, 15 minutes in. We're good. We're good. Chapter 5. Part 1. Even in the boozy, druggy days, Johnny Marinville's recall had been pretty relentless. In 1986, while riding in the back seat of Sean Hutter's so-called party-mobile, Sean had been doing the Friday night East Hampton rounds with Johnny and 3 others in the big old 65 Caddy. He had been involved in a fatal accident. Sean had been too drunk to walk, let alone drive. Who had been too drunk? Had rolled the party-mobile over twice, trying to make the turn from Eggamogan Lane onto Route B, without slowing down. The girl sitting next to Hutter had been killed. Sean's spine had been pulverized. The only party-mobile he ran these days was a motorized caddy wheelchair, the kind you steered with your chin. The others had suffered minor injuries. Johnny had considered himself lucky to get off with a bruised spleen and a broken foot. But the thing was, he was the only one who remembered what had happened. Johnny found this so curious that he had questioned the survivors carefully, even Sean, who kept crying and telling him to go away. Johnny hadn't obliged until he'd gotten what he wanted. What the hell, he figured. Sean owed him. Patty Nickerson said she had a vague memory of Sean saying, "Hold on, we're going for a ride," just before it happened. But that was it. With the others, recall simply stopped short of the accident and then picked up again at some point after it, as if their memories had been squirted with some amnesia-producing ink. Sean himself claimed to remember nothing after getting out of the shower that afternoon and wiping the steam off the mirror so he could see to shave. After that, he said, everything was black until he'd awakened in the hospital. He might have been lying about that, but Johnny didn't think so. Yet he himself remembered everything. Sean hadn't said, hold on, we're going for a ride. He had said, hang on, we're going wide. And laughing as he said it, he went on. Guys, open the door! Phoebe! Give me a minute. Okay. Oh my god, Mom's back, let me attack her. Do you know what Hartley does when they come in? She comes and she watches Phoebe go in the kitchen, and then she comes over to the dining room doorway, and she stands there. She watches for her to come into the living room and then attacks her. That's how they play. I'm like, really? Good gracious. All right. They came back from a walk, so. She is so overexcited right now. What are you looking for? You goof. And laughing as he said it. He went on laughing even when the partymobile had started to roll. Johnny remembered Patty screaming, my hair, oh shit, my hair. And now she had landed on her crotch with a ball-numbing thud when the car went over. Or landed on his crotch with a ball-thumbing thud when the car went over. He remembered Bruno Gartner bellowing, and the sound of the partymobile's collapsing roof, driving Rachel Timorov's head down into her neck, splitting her skull wide open like a bone flower. A tight, crushing sound it had been. The sound you hear in your head when you smash an ice cube between your teeth. He remembered shit. He knew that was part of being a writer, but he didn't know if it was nature or nurture, cause or effect. He supposed it didn't matter. The thing was, he remembered shit even when it was as confusing as the final 30 seconds of a big fireworks display. Stuff that overlapped seemed to automatically separate and fall into line even as it was happening, like iron fillings lining up under the pull of a magnet. Until the night Sean Hutter had rolled his partymobile, Johnny had never wished for anything different. He had never wished for anything different since. Nick wants chicken bacon ranch? What? This is chicken bacon ranch crumble. I don't know. Do you want to go down and see if you trade it for another pepperoni if there's one? Is there any more pepperoni? I'll have him trade it and then we'll put it in. I just thought maybe Nick wants it there. Do you want it? Nick can try it. We'll see if Nick wants to try it. If not, we'll do it for dinner. What do you think? Yeah? Well, I only see one of them. As I said, we can do it. Oh, well then, go ahead and put it in. He had never wished for anything different since, until now. Right now, a little ink squirted into the old memory cells might be just fine. The amnesia ink. He saw splinters jump from the jamb of the projection booth door and landed in Cynthia's hair when Audrey fired the pistol. He felt one of the slugs drone past his ear. He saw Steve, down on one knee, but apparently okay, bat away the revolver when the woman hucked it at him. She lifted her upper lip, snarled at Steve like a cornered dog, then turned back and clamped her hands around the kid's throat again. "Go on," Johnny shouted at himself. "Go on and help him, like you did before, when you shot the cat." But he couldn't. He could see everything. Oh, the big cat. He could see everything, but he couldn't move. Things began to overlap then, but his mind insisted on sequencing them, neatening them, neatening, like neat, them, giving them a coherent shape, like a narrative. He saw Steve leap at Audrey, telling her to quit it, to let the boy go, cupping her neck with one hand and grabbing her wrist with the other. At that same moment, Johnny was slammed past the skinny girl and into the room with the force of a stuntman shot from a cannon. It was Ralph, of course, hitting him from behind and bawling his son's name at the top of his lungs. Johnny flew out over the two-step drop, knees bent, convinced he was going to sustain multiple fractures at the very least, convinced that the boy was dying or already dead, convinced that Audrey Weiler's mind had snapped under the strain and she had fallen under the delusion that David Carver was either the cop or a minion of the cop. And all this time, his eyes went on recording and his brain kept on receiving the images and storing them. He saw the way Audrey's muscular legs were spread, the material of her skirt strained taut between them. He also saw he was going to touch down near her. He landed on one foot, like a skater who has forgotten his skates. His knee buckled, he let it, throwing himself forward into the woman, grabbing her hair. She pulled her head back and snapped at his fingers. At the same instant, except Johnny's mind insisted that it was the next instant, even now wanting to reduce this madness to something coherent, a narrative which would flow and train. Steve tore her hands away from the kid's throat. Johnny saw the white marks of her palms and fingers there, and then his momentum was carrying him by. She missed biting him, which was the good news, but he missed the grip on her hair, which was the bad. She voiced a guttural cry as he collided with the wall. His left arm shot out through one of the projection slots, up to the shoulder, and for one awful moment he was sure that the rest of him was going to follow it. Out, down, goodbye. It was impossible. The hole was nowhere near big enough for that, but he thought it anyway. At the same moment, his mind once more insisting that it was the next moment, the next thing, the next sentence, Ralph Carver yelled, "Get your hands off my boy, bitch!" Johnny retrieved his arm and turned around, putting his back to the wall. He saw Steve and Ralph drag the screaming woman off David. He saw the boy collapse against the wall and slide slowly down it, the marks on his throat standing out brutally. He saw Cynthia come down the steps and into the room, trying to look everywhere at once. "Grab the kid, boss!" Steve panted. He was struggling with Audrey, one hand still clamped on her wrist, and the other now around her waist. She bucked him under like a She bucked under him like a canyon mustang. "Grab him and get him out of here!" Audrey screamed and pulled free. When Ralph made a clumsy attempt to get his arms around her neck and pull her in a headlock, she shoved the heel of one hand under his chin and pushed him back. She retreated a step, now saw David, and snarled again, her lips drawing away from her teeth. She made a move to go in his direction, and Ralph said, "Touch him again and I'll kill you. Promise." "Ah, fuck this," Johnny thought, and snatched the boy up. He was warm and limp and heavy in his arms. Johnny's back, already outraged by nearly a continent's worth of motorcycling, gave a warning twinge. Audrey glanced at Ralph, as if daring him to try and make good on his promise, then tensed to leap at Johnny. Before she could, Steve was on her once more. He grabbed her around the waist again, then pivoted on his heels, the two of them face to face. She was uttering a long and continuous caterwauling that made Johnny's fillings ache. Halfway through his second spin, Steve let her go. Audrey flew backward like a stone cast out of a sling. her feet stuttering on the floor, still caterwauling. Cynthia, who was behind her, dropped to her hands and knees with the speed of a born playground survivor. Audrey collided with her shin high and went over backward, sprawling on the lighter colored sprawling on the lighter colored rectangle where the second projector had rested. She stared up at them through the tumble of her hair, momentarily dazed. Get him out of here, boss. Steve waved his hand at the steps leading up to the projection booth door. There's something wrong with her. She's like the animals. What do you mean, like them? Johnny thought. She fucking well is one. He heard what Steve was telling him, but he didn't start toward the door. Once again, he seemed incapable of movement. Audrey scrambled to her feet, sliding up to the corner of the room. Her upper lip was still rising and falling in a jagged snarl, eyes moving from Johnny and the unconscious boy cradled in his arms to Ralph, and then to Cynthia, who had now also gotten to her feet and was pressing against Steve's side. Johnny thought briefly and longingly for the Rossi shotgun and the Ruger 44. Both were in the lobby, leaning against the ticket booth. The booth had offered a good view of the street, but it had been easier to leave the guns outside it, given the limited space, and neither he nor Ralph had thought to bring them up here. He now believed that one of the scariest lessons this nightmare had to offer was how lethally unprepared for survival they all were. Yet they had survived, most of them anyway, so far. Takala! The woman spoke in a voice that was both frightening and powerful. Nothing like her earlier one, her storytelling voice. That one had been low and often hesitant. To Johnny, this one seemed only a step or two above a dog's bark. And was she laughing? He thought that at least part of her was. And what of that strange, swimming darkness just below the surface of her skin? Was he really seeing that? Min in tow! Cynthia cast a bewildered glance at Steve. What's she saying? Steve shook his head. She looked at Johnny. It's the cop's language, he said. He cast his peculiarly efficient recollection back to the moment when the cop had apparently sized a buzzard on him. Timo, he snapped at Audrey Weiler. Candy Latch. That wasn't quite right, but it must have at least been close. Audrey recoiled, and for a moment there was a very human look of surprise on her face. Then the lip lifted again, and the lunatic smile reappeared in her eyes. What did you say to her? Cynthia asked Johnny. I have no idea. Boss, you gotta get the kid out now. Johnny took a step backward, meaning to do just that. Audrey reached into the pocket of her dress as he did and brought it out, curled around a fistful of something. She stared at him, only at him now, John Edward Marinville, distinguished novelist and extraordinary thinker, with her snarling beast eyes. She held her hand out, wrist up. Kata, she cried, laughed. Kata, katak. What you take is what you are, of course. Kata, katak, mito, take this, sota. She opened her hand and showed him her offering. The emotional weather inside his head changed at once, and yet still saw everything and sequenced it, just as he had when Sean Hutter's goddamn partymobile had rolled over. She had kept on recording everything. He had kept on recording everything then, when he had been sure he was going to die. And he went on recording everything now, when he was suddenly consumed with hate for the boy in his arms and overwhelmed by the desire to put something, his motorcycle key would do nicely, into the interfering little prey boy's throat and open him like a can of beer. He thought at first that there were 3 odd-looking charms lying on her open palm, the sort of thing girls sometimes wore dangling on their bracelets. But They were too big, too heavy. Not charms, but carvings, stone carvings. Each had each about 2 inches long. One was a snake. The second was a buzzard with one wing chipped off. Mad, bulging eyes stared out at him from beneath its bald dome. The third was a rat on its hind legs. They all looked pitted and ancient. "Kata!" she screamed. "Kata! Kata! Kill the boy! Kill him now! Kill him!" Steve stepped forward. With her attention and concentration fully fixed on Johnny, she saw him only at the last instant. He slapped the stones from her hand, and they flew into the corner of the room. One, it was the snake, broke in two. Audrey screamed with horror and vexation. The murderous fury, which had come over Johnny's mind, dissipated, but didn't depart completely. He could feel his eyes wanting to turn toward the corner where the carvings lay, waiting for him. All he had to do was pick them up. "Get him the fuck out of here," Steve yelled. Audrey lunged for the carvings. Steve seized her arm and yanked her back. Her skin was darkening and sagging. Johnny thought that the process which had changed her was now trying to reverse itself, without much success. She was, shrinking? Diminishing? He didn't know the right word, but "Get him out!" Steve yelled again and smacked Johnny on the shoulder. That woke him up. He began to turn, and then Ralph was there. He had snatched David from Johnny's arms almost before Johnny knew it was happening. Ralph bounded up the stairs, clumsy but powerful, and was gone from the projection booth without a single look back. Audrey saw him go. She howled. It was despair Johnny heard in that howl now, and lunged for the stones again. Steve yanked her back. There was a particular ripping sound, and Audrey's right arm pulled off at the shoulder. Steve was left holding it in his hand, like a drumstick of an overcooked chicken. Wow. Part 2. Audrey seemed unaware of what had happened to her. One armed, the right side of her dress now darkening with blood. She made for the carvings, gibbering in that strange language. Steve was frozen in place, looking at what he held. A lightly freckled human arm with a Casio watch on the wrist. The boss was equally frozen. If it hadn't been for Cynthia, Steve later thought, Audrey would have gotten to the carvings again. God knew what would have happened if she had. Even when she had been obviously focusing the power of the stones on the boss. Steve had felt the backlash. There had been nothing sexual about it this time. This time it had been about murder and nothing else. Before Audrey could fall on her knees in the corner and grab her toys, Cynthia kicked them daftly away, sending them skittering along the wall with the cutouts in it. Audrey howled again, and this time a spray of blood came out of her mouth along with the sound. She turned her head to them, and Steve staggered backward, actually raising a hand, as if to block the sight of her from his vision. Audrey's formerly pretty face now drooped from the front of her skull in sweating wrinkles. Her staring eyeballs hung from widening sockets. Her skin was blackening and splitting. Yet none of this was the worst. The worst came to Steve as Steve dropped the hideously warm thing he was holding, and he lurched to his feet, and she lurched to her feet. "Hey, you okay? Are you listening? Did I interrupt your show? I hope not." "I'm very sorry," she said, and in her choked and failing voice, Steve heard a real woman, not this decaying monstrosity. "I never meant to hurt anyone. Don't touch the katas. Whatever else you do, don't touch the katas." Steve looked at Cynthia. She stared back, and he could read her mind in her wide eyes. "I touched one, twice. How lucky was I?" "Very," Steve thought. "I think you were very lucky. I think we both were." Audrey staggered toward them and away from the pitted gray stones. Steve could smell a rich odor of blood and decay. He reached out, but couldn't bring himself to actually put a restraining hand on her shoulder, even though she was headed for the stairs and the hallway. Headed in the direction Ralph had taken his boy. He couldn't bring himself to do it because he knew his fingers would sink in. Now he could hear a plopping, pattering sound as parts of her began to liquefy and fall off in a kind of flesh rain. She mounted the stairs and lurched out through the door. Cynthia looked up at Steve for a moment, her face pinched and white. He put his arm around her waist and followed Johnny up the stairs. Audrey made it about halfway down the short but steep flight of stairs leading to the second-floor hall, then fell. The sound of her inside her blood-soaked dress was grisly, a splashing sound, almost. Yet she was still alive. She began to crawl, her hair hanging in strings, mercifully obscuring most of her dangling face. At the far end, by the stairs leading down to the lobby, Ralph stood with David in his arms, staring at the oncoming creature. "Shoot her," Johnny roared. "For God's sake, somebody shoot her." "Can't," Steve said. "No guns up here. But the kids? And that one's empty." "Ralph, get downstairs with David," Johnny said. He started carefully down the hall. Get down before. But the thing which had been Audrey Weiler had no further interest than David, it seemed. It reached the arched entrance to the balcony, then crawled through it. Almost at once the support timbers, dried out by the desert climate and dined upon by generations of termites, began to groan. Steve hurried after Johnny, his arm still around Cynthia. Ralph came toward them from the other end of the hall. They met just in time to see the thing in the soaked dress reach the balcony railing. Audrey had crawled over the mostly deflated sex doll, leaving a broad streak of blood and less identifiable fluids across its plastic midsection. Frida's pursed mouth might have been expressing outrage at such treatment. What remained of Audrey Weiler was still clenching the railing, still attempting to pull itself up enough to dive over the side when the supports let go and the balcony tore away from the wall with a large, dusty roar. At first it slipped outward on the level, like a tray or a floating platform, tearing away boards from the edge of the hallway and forcing Steve and the others back as the old carpet first tore open and then gaped like a seismic fault. Laths snapped, nails squealed as they divorced the boards to which they had been wedded. Then, at last, the balcony began to tilt. Audrey tumbled over the side. For just a moment, Steve saw her feet sticking out of the dust, and then she was gone. A moment later, the balcony was gone too, falling like a stone and hitting the seats below with a tremendous crash. Dust boiled up in a miniature mushroom cloud. "David!" Steve shouted. "What about David? Is he alive?" "I don't know," Ralph said. He looked at them with dazed and teary eyes. "I'm sure he was when I brought him out of the projection booth, but now, I don't know. I can't feel him breathing at all." "Give me just a second." Sorry, I was getting my son's lunch out so he gets back, he can have lunch. All right. Whew. Let's find out if David's alive, shall we? Hopefully we'll get that far. Part 3. All the doors leading into the auditorium had been choked open, and the lobby was hazed with dust from the fallen balcony. They carried David over to one of the street doors, where the draft from the outside pushed the worst of the drifting dust away. Put him down, Cynthia said. She was trying to think what to do next. Hell, what to do first. But her thoughts kept junking up on her. And lay him straight. Let's turn his airways into freeways. What? Oven, off or on? Go ahead and turn it off. Ralph looked at her hopefully as he and Steve lowered David to the threadbare carpet. Do you know anything about this? Depends on what you mean, she said. Some first aid, including artificial respiration. From when I was back at Daughters and Sisters, yeah. But if you're asking if I know anything about ladies who turn into homicidal maniacs and then decay, no. He's all I got, miss, Ralph said. All that's left of my family. Cynthia closed her eyes and bent toward David. What she felt relieved her enormously. The faint but clear touch of breath on her face. He's alive. I can feel him breathing. She looked up at Ralph and smiled. I'm not surprised you couldn't. Your face is swelled up like an inner tube. Yeah, maybe that's what it was. Maybe that was it. But mostly, I was just so afraid. He tried to smile back at her and failed. He let out a gusty sigh and groped backward to lean against the boarded-over candy counter. I'm going to help him now, Cynthia said. She looked down at the boy's pale face and closed eyes. I'm just going to help you along, David. Speed things up. Let me help you, okay? Let me help you. She turned his head gently to one side, wincing at the finger marks on his neck. In the auditorium, a hanging piece of balcony gave up the ghost and fell with a crash. The others looked that way, but Cynthia's concentration remained on David. She used the fingers of her left hand to open his mouth, leaned forward, and gently pinched his nostrils shut with her right hand. Then she put her mouth over his and exhaled. His chest rose more steeply, then settled as she released his nose and pulled away from him. She bent to one side and spoke into his ear in a low voice. Come back to us, David. We need you, and you need us. She breathed deep into his mouth again and said, Come back to us, David. As he exhaled a mixture of his air in hers, she looked into his face. His unassisted breathing was a little stronger now, she thought, and she could see his eyeballs moving beneath his blue-tinged lids. But he showed no signs of waking up. Come back to us, David. Come back. Johnny looked around, blinking like someone just back from the further reaches of his thoughts. Where's Mary? You don't suppose the goddamn balcony fell on her, do you? Why would it have? Steve asked. She was with the old guy. But you think she's still with the old guy? And you think she's still with the old guy after all the yelling? After the goddamn balcony fell off the goddamn wall? You got a point, Steve said. Here we go again, Johnny said. I knew it. Come on. I guess we better go look for her. Cynthia took no notice. She knelt with her face in front of David's, searching it earnestly with her eyes. I don't know where you are, kid. Get your ass back here. It's time to saddle up and get out of Dodge. Johnny picked up the shotgun and the rifle. He handed the latter to Ralph. Stay here with your boy and the young lady, he said. We'll be back. Yeah, what if you're not? Johnny looked at him uncertainly for a moment, then broke into a sunny grin. Burn the documents, trash the radio, and swallow your death capsule. Huh? How the fuck should I know? Use your judgment? I can tell you this much, Ralph. As soon as we've collected Miss Jackson, we're totally historical. Come on, Steve. Down the far left-hand aisle, unless you've an urge to climb Mount Balcony. Ralph watched him through the door, then turned back to Cynthia and his son. What's wrong with David? Do you have any idea? Did that bitch choke him into a coma? He had a friend who was in a coma once. David did. He came out of it. It was a miracle, everyone said, but I wouldn't wish that on my worst enemy. Is that what's wrong with him, do you think? I don't think he's conscious at all, let alone in a coma. Do you see the way his eyelids are moving? It's more like he's sleeping and dreaming or in a trance. She looked up at him. Their eyes met for a moment, and then Ralph knelt back across from her. He brushed his son's hair off his brow and then kissed him gently between his eyes, where the skin was puckered a faint frown. "Come back, David," he said. "Please come back." David breathed quietly through pursed lips. Behind his bruised eyelids, the eyes moved and moved. Part 4. In the men's room, they found one dead cougar, its head mostly blown off, and one dead veterinarian with his eyes open. In the ladies' room, they found nothing, or so it seemed to Steve. "Shine your light back over here," Johnny told him. When Steve retrained the flashlight on the window, he said, "No, not the window, the floor beneath it." Steve dropped the beam and ran it along half a dozen beer bottles, standing against the wall, just to the right of the window. "The doc's booby trap," Johnny said. "Not broken, but neatly set aside." "Interesting. I didn't even notice they were gone from the window ledge. That's good on you, boss." "Come on over here." Johnny crossed to the window, held it up, peeked out, then moved it aside enough for Steve to join him. "Cast your mind back to your arrival at this bucolic palace of dreams, Steve. What's the last thing you did before sliding all the way into this room? Can you remember?" Steve nodded. "Sure. We stacked 2 crates to make it easier to climb in the window. I pushed the top one off because I figured if the cop came back here and saw them piled up that way, it would be like a pointing arrow." "Right. But what do you see now?" Steve used his flashlight, although he didn't really need to. The wind had died almost completely, and all but the most errant skims of dust had dropped. There was even a scantling of moon. "They're stacked again," he said, and turned to Johnny with an alarmed look. "Aw, shit. Entrogen came while we were occupied with David. Came and took her," was how he meant to finish, but he saw the boss shaking his head and stopped. "That's not what this says." Johnny took the flashlight and ran it along the row of bottles again. "Not smashed. Set neatly aside in a row." "Who did that? Audrey?" "No, she went the other way, after David." "Billingsley?" "Not possible, considering the shape he was in before he died." "That leaves Mary. But would she have done it for the cop?" "I doubt it," Steve said. "Me too. I think that if the cop had shown up back here, she would have come running to us, screaming bloody murder." "And why the stacked crates?" "It's got some personal experience of Collie Entrogen. He's 6'6" at least, probably more. He couldn't have needed a step up to get in the window. To me, these stacked crates suggest either a shorter person, a ruse to get Mary into a position where she could be grabbed, or maybe both. I could be deducing, I suppose, but so there could be more of them? More like Audrey?" "Maybe, but I don't think you can conclude that out of what we see here. I just don't think she would have put those beer bottles aside for any stranger. Not even a bawling little kid, you know? I think she would have come to get us." Steve took the flashlight and shone it on Billingsley's tile fish, so joyful and funky here in the dark. He wasn't surprised to find that he no longer liked it much. Now it was like laughter in a haunted house or a clown at midnight. He snapped the light off. "What are you thinking, boss?" "Don't call me that anymore, Steve. I never liked it that much to begin with." "All right, what are you thinking, Johnny?" Johnny looked around to make sure they were still alone. Good gracious Lord. There we go. His face, dominated by his swelled and leaning nose, looked both tired and intent. As he shook out another 3 aspirin and dry swallowed them, Steve realized an amazing thing. Marinville looked younger. In spite of everything he'd been through, he looked younger. He swallowed again, grimacing at the taste of old pills, and said, "David's mom." "What?" "It could have been. Take a second. Think about it. You'll see how pretty it is, in a ghastly kind of way." Steve did, and saw how completely it made sense of the situation. He didn't know where Audrey Weiler's story had parted company with the truth, but he did know that at some point she had been gotten to, changed by the stones she had called the cantas, changed, afflicted with a kind of horrible degenerative rabies. What happened to her could have happened to Ellen Carver as well. Steve suddenly found himself hoping Mary Jackson was dead. That was awful, but in a case like this, dead might be better, mightn't it? Better than being under the spell of the cantas. Better than what apparently happened when the cantas were taken away. What do we do now? He asked. Get out of town by any means possible. All right. If David's still unconscious, we'll carry him. Let's do it. They started back to the lobby. Part 5. David Carver walked down Anderson Avenue past West Wentworth Middle School. Written on the side of the school building in yellow spray paint were the words, "In these silences, something may rise." Then he turned on Ohio Corner and began walking down Bear Street. That was pretty funny, since Bear Street and the Bear Street Woods were 9 big suburban blocks from the junior high. But that's the way things worked in dreams. Soon he would wake up in his own bedroom, and the whole thing would fall apart anyway. Ahead of him were 3 bikes in the middle of the street that had been turned upside down, and their wheels were spinning in the air. And Pharaoh said unto Joseph, "I have dreamed a dream," someone said, "and I have heard say of thee that thou canst understand a dream to interpret it." David looked across the street and saw Reverend Martin. He was drunk and needed a shave. In one hand he held a bottle of Seagram's 7 whiskey. Between his feet was a yellow puddle of puke. David could barely stand to look at him. His eyes were empty and dead. And Joseph answered Pharaoh, saying, "It is not in me. God shall give Pharaoh an answer of peace." Reverend Martin toasted him with the bottle and then drank. "Go get him," he said. "Now we're going to discover if you know where Moses was when the lights went out." David walked on. He thought of turning around, then a queer but strangely persuasive idea came to him. If he did turn around, he would see the mummy tottering after him in a cloud of ancient wrappings and spices. He walked a little faster. As he passed the bikes in the street, he noted that one of the turning wheels made a piercing and unpleasant sound. Reek, reek, reek. It made him think of a weather vane on top of Bud Suds, the leprechaun with the pot of gold under his arm. The one in Desperation. I'm in Desperation, and this is a dream. I fell asleep while I was trying to pray. I'm upstairs in the old movie theater. There shall arise among you a prophet and a dreamer of dreams, someone said. David looked across the street and saw a dead cat, a cougar, hanging from a speed limit sign. The cougar had a human head, Audrey Weiler's head. Her eyes rolled at him tiredly, and he thought she was trying to smile. But if he would say so to you, let us speak other gods. You shall not hearken unto them. He looked away, grimacing, and here, on his own side of Bear Street, a sweet pie, standing on the porch of his friend Brian's house. Brian's house had never been on Bear Street before, but now the rules had apparently changed. She was holding Melissa's sweetheart clasped in her hands. He was Mr. Big Boogeyman after all, she said. You know that now, don't you? Yes, I know, Pie. Walk a little faster, David. Mr. Big Boogeyman's after you. The desert smell of wrappings and old spices was stronger in his nose now, and David walked faster still. Up ahead was the break in the bushes, which made the entrance to the Ho Chi Minh Trail, which marked the entrance of the Ho Chi Minh Trail. There had never been anything there before but the occasional hopscotch grid or Kathy Loves Russell chalked on the sidewalk. But today, the entrance to the path was guarded by an ancient stone statue. One much too big to be a Kanta, little god. This is a Kanta, big god. A Kantok, big god. It was a jackal with a cocked head, an open snarling mouth, and buggy cartoon eyes that were full of fury. One of its ears had been either chipped away or eroded away. The tongue of its mouth was not the tongue at all, but a human head. Collie Entrogen's head. Smokey Bear, hat and all. Fear me and turn aside from this path, the cop in the mouth of the jackal said as David approached. Me to Candalak, fear the unformed. There are other gods than yours. Kanta, Kantok. You know I speak the truth. Yes, but my God is strong, David said in a conversational voice. He reached into the jackal's open mouth and seized its psychotic tongue. He heard Entrogen scream and felt it, a scream that vibrates against his palm like a joy buzzer. A moment later, the jackal's entire head exploded, and in a soundless, shardless flash of light. What remained was a stone hulk that stopped short at the shoulders. He walked down the path, aware that he was glimpsing plants he had never seen anywhere in Ohio before. Spiny cactuses and drum cactuses, winter fat, squatty, Russian thistle, also known as tumbleweed. From the bushes at the side of the path stepped his mother. Her face was black and wrinkled, in an ancient bag of dough. Her eyes drooped. The sight of her in this state filled him with sorrow and horror. Yes, your God is strong, she said. No argument there. But look what he's done to me. Is this strength worth admiring? Is this a God worth having? She held her hands out to him, displaying her rotten palms. God didn't do that, David said, and began to cry. The policeman did it. But God let it happen, she countered, and one of her eyeballs dropped out of her head. The same God who let Entrogen kill Kirsty downstairs and then hung her body on a hook for you to find. What God is this? Turn aside from him and embrace mine. Mine is at least honest about his cruelty. But this whole conversation, not just the petitioning about the haughty, threatening tone of it, or not just the petitioning, but the haughty, threatening tone of it, was so foreign to David's memory of his mother that he began to walk forward again. Had to walk forward again. The mummy was behind him, and the mummy was slow, yes, but he reckoned that this was one of the ways in which the mummy caught up with his victims after using his ancient Egyptian magic to put obstacles in their path. Stay away from me, the brooding mother thing screamed. Stay away, or I'll turn you to stone in the mouth of a god. You'll be Kanta in Kantok. You can't do that, David said patiently. And you're not my mother. My mother's with my sister in heaven with God. What a joke, the rotting thing cried indignantly. Its voice was gargly now, like the cop's voice. It was spitting blood and teeth as it talked. Heaven's a joke, the kind of thing your Reverend Martin would spiel happily on about for hours, if you kept buying him shots and beers. It's no more real than Tom Billingsley's fish and horses. You won't tell me you swallowed it, will you? A smart boy like you. Did you? Oh, Davy, I don't know whether to laugh or cry. What she did was smile furiously. There's no heaven, no afterlife at all, not for such as us, only the gods. Kantas, can. He suddenly realized that what this confused sermon was about. Holding him so the mummy could catch up and choke him to death. He stepped forward, seizing the raving head, and squeezed it between his hands. He surprised himself by laughing as he did it, because it was so much like the stuff of the crazy cable TV preachers did. They grabbed their victims upside the head and bellowed stuff like, Sickness, come out! Tumors, come out! Rheumatiz, come out! In the name of Jesus. Yeah, they do. There was another one of those soundless flashes, and this time, not even the body was left, let alone on the path again. He was alone on the path again. He walked on, sorrow working at his heart and mind, thinking of what the mother thing had said. No heaven, no afterlife at all, not for such as us. That might be true, or it might not be. He had no way of knowing. But the thing had also said that God had allowed his mother and sister to be killed. And that was true, wasn't it? Well, maybe. How's a kid supposed to know about stuff like that? Ahead was the oak tree with the Viet Cong lookout in it. At the base of the tree was a piece of red and silver paper, a Three Musketeers wrapper. David bent over, picked it up, stuck it in his mouth, sucking the smears of sweet chocolate off the inside with his eyes closed. Take, eat, he heard Reverend Martin say. This was a memory and not a voice, which was something of a relief. This is my body, broken for you and for many. He opened his eyes, fearing he might nevertheless see Reverend Martin's drunken face and dead eyes. But Reverend Martin wasn't there. David spat the wrapper out and climbed to the Viet Cong lookout, the sweet taste of chocolate in his mouth. He climbed into the sound of rock and roll music. Someone was sitting cross-legged on the platform and looking out at the bare street woods. His posture was so similar to Brian's, legs crossed, chin propped on the palms of his hands, that for a moment David was sure it was his old friend, only grown to young adulthood. David thought he could handle that. Okay. It wouldn't be any stranger than the rotting effigy of his mother or the cougar with Audrey Wilder's head, and a hell of a lot less distressing. Slung over... Ooh, this is quite the long one, isn't it? Oh, yes, it is. Good. Slung over the young man's shoulder was a radio on a strap. Not a Walkman or a boombox. It looked older than either. There were two circular decals pasted on its leather case, one a yellow smile guy, the other a peace sign. The music was coming from a small exterior speaker. The sound was tiny, but cool, still way cool. Hot drums, killer rhythm guitar, and a somehow perfect rock and roll vocal. I was feeling so bad. Asked my friend, doctor, just what I had. Bry, he asked, grabbing the bottom of the platform and pulling himself up. That you? The man turned. He was slim, dark-haired, under a Yankees baseball cap, wearing jeans, a plain gray t-shirt, and big reflector shades. David could see his own face in them. He was the first person David had seen in this, whatever it was, that he didn't know. Brian's not here, David, he said. Who are you, then? If the guy in the reflector sunglasses started to rot or to bleed out like nitrogen, David was vacating this tree in a hurry. And never mind the mummy that might be lurking somewhere in the woods below. This is our place. Mine and Bry's. Brian can't be here, the dark-haired man said pleasantly. Brian's alive, you see. I don't get you. But he was afraid he did. What did you tell Marinville when he tried to talk to the coyotes? It took David a moment to remember, and that was surprising because what he said hadn't seemed to come from him, but through him. I said not to speak to them in a language of the dead, except it wasn't really me who... The man in the sunglasses waved this off. The way Marinville's tried to speak to the coyotes is sort of the way we're speaking now. CM Talankandalak, do you understand? Yes, we speak the language of the informed, the language of the dead. David began to shiver. I'm dead too, then? Aren't I? I'm dead? Nope, wrong. Lose one turn. The man turned up the volume on his radio. I said doctor, Mr. M.D., and smiled. The rascals, he said. Felix Cavalier on vocals. Cool. Yes, David said and meant it. He felt he could listen to the song all day. It made him think of the beach and the cute girls in two-piece bikini suits. The man in the Yankees cap listened a moment longer, then turned the radio off. When he did, David saw a ragged scar on the underside of his right wrist, as if at some point he had tried to kill himself. Then it occurred to him that the man he might have done a lot more than just try. Wasn't this a place of the dead? He suppressed a shiver. The man took off his Yankees cap, wiped the back of his neck with it, put it back on, and looked at David seriously. This is the land of the dead, but you're an exception. You're special. Very. Who are you? It doesn't matter. Just another name of the Young Rascals Felix Cavalier fan club, if it comes to that, the man said. He looked around, sighed, grimaced a little. But I'll tell you one thing, young man. It doesn't surprise me at all that the land of the dead should turn out to be located in the suburbs of Columbus, Ohio. He looked back to David, his faint smile fading. I guess it's time we got down to business. Time is short. You're going to have a bit of a sore throat when you wake up, by the way, and you may feel disoriented at first. They're moving you to the back of the truck Steve Ames drove into town. They feel a strong urge to vacate the American West. Take it any way you want, but I can't say I blame them. Why are you here? To make sure you know why you're here, David. To begin with, at least. So tell me, why are you here? I don't know what you're... Oh, please, the man with the radio said. His mirror sunglasses flashed in the sun. If you don't know, you're in deep shit. Why are you on Earth? Why did God make you? David looked at him in consternation. Come on, the man said impatiently. These are easy questions. Why did God make you? Why did God make me? Why did God make anyone? To love and serve him, David said slowly. Okay, good. Start anyway. And what is God? What's your experience of the nature of God? I don't want to say. David looked down at his hands, then up at the grave, intent man, the strangely familiar man in the sunglasses. I'm scared I'll get in Dutch. He hesitated, and then dragged out what he was really afraid of. I'm scared you're God. The man uttered a short, rueful laugh. In a way, that's pretty funny, but never mind. Let's stay focused here. What do you know about the nature of God, David? What is your experience? With a great reluctance, David said, God is cruel. He looked at his hands again and counted slowly to 5. When he had reached it, and still hadn't been fried by the lightning bolt, he looked up again. The man in the jeans and t-shirt was still grave and intent, but David saw no anger in him. That's right, God is cruel. We slow down, the mummy already catches us in the end, and God is cruel. Why is God cruel, David? For the moment he didn't answer, and then something Reverend Martin had said came to him. The TV in the corner had been broadcasting the soundless spring training baseball game that day. God's cruel is refining, he said. Where the mine and God is the miner. Well, and all cruelty is good? God is good and cruelty is good? No, hardly any of it's good, David said. For a single horrified second, he saw Pye dangling from the hook on the wall. Pye who walked around ants on the sidewalk because she didn't want to hurt them. What is cruel done for evil? Malice. Who are you, sir? Never mind. Who is the father of malice? The devil, or maybe those other gods my mother talked about? Never mind Kata and Kantak, at least for now. We have bigger fish to fry, so pay attention. What is faith? What is faith? That one was easy. The substance of things hoped for and the evidence of things not seen. Yeah. And what is the eternal state of the faithful? Love and acceptance, I think. And what is the opposite of faith? That was tough. A red hairball, in fact. Like one of those damned reading achievement tests. Pick A, B, C, or D, except here, you didn't even get a choice. Disbelief, he ventured. No, not disbelief, but unbelief. The first is natural, the second is willful. And when one is in disbelief, David, what is that one spiritual state? He thought about it, then shook his head. I don't know. Yes, you do. He thought about it and realized he did. The spiritual state of unbelief is desperation. Yes, look down, David. He did and was shocked to see that the Viet Cong lookout was no longer in a tree. It now floated like a magic carpet made out of boards above a vast, blighted countryside. He could see buildings here and there amid rows of gray and listless plants. One was a trailer with a bumper sticker claiming the owner a Snapple-drinking, Clinton-bashing son of a bitch, and another was the mining quinset they'd seen on the way into town. Another was the municipal building. Another was Bud Suds. The grinning leprechaun, with a pot of gold under his arm, peered out of the dead and strangulated jungle. This is the poison failed, the man in the reflector sunglasses said. What's gone on here makes Agent Orange look like sugar candy. There will be no sweetening this earth. It must be eradicated. So with salt, plowed under. Do you know why? Because it will spread? No, it can't. Evil is born fragile and stupid, dying soon after the ecosystem is poisoned. Then why? Because it's an affront to God. There's no other reason. Nothing hidden or held back, no fine print. The poisoned field is a perversity and an affront to God. Now look down again. He did. The buildings had slipped behind them. Now the Viet Cong lookout floated above a vast pit. From this perspective, it looked like a sore which had rotted through the skin of the earth into its underlying flesh. The sides sloped inward and downward in neat zigzags like stairs. In a way, looking into this place was like looking into, walk a little faster, a pyramid turned inside out. There were pines on the hills south of the pit, and some grew high up around the edges, but the pit itself was sterile. Not even juniper could grow there. On the near side, it would be the north. David supposed if the poisoned field was the town of Desperation, these neat setbacks had broken through near the bottom. Where they had been there as now a long slope of stony rubble. Okay, so where they had been is now stony rubble. At the side of the landslide and not too far from the broad gravel road, good Lord. At the side of the landslide and not too far from the broad gravel road leading down from the rim of the pit, there was a black and gaping hole. The sight of it made David profoundly uneasy. It was as if a monster buried in the desert ground and had opened its eyes. The landslide surrounding it made him easy too, because it looked somehow well planned. At the bottom of the pit, just below the ragged hole, was a parking area filled with ore freighters, diggers, pickup trucks, and tread-equipped vehicles that looked like a sort of World War II tanks. Nearby stood a rusty quinset hut with a stacked sticking crooked out of the roof. Welcome to Rattlesnake Number 2, read the sign on the door, providing jobs and tax dollars to Central Nevada since 1951. Off to the left of the metal building was a squat concrete cube. The sign on this one was Belief. Powder magazine, authorized personnel only. Good gracious. Parked between the two buildings was Collie Entrogen's road dusty Caprice. The driver's door, still open, and the dome light still on, illuminating an interior that looked like an abattoir. A baiter. On the dash, a plastic bear with a knotty head had been stuck beside the compass. Then all that was sliding behind them. You know this place, don't you, David? Is it the China Pit? It is, isn't it? Yes. They swooped closer to the side, and David saw that the pit was, in its own way, even more docile than the poisoned field. There was no whole stones or outcrops in the earth, at least not that he could see. Everything had been reduced to an awful yellow rubble. Beyond the parking area and the buildings were vast heaps of even more radically crumbled rock, pitted on black plastic. These are waste dumps, his guide remarked. The stuff piled on the plastic is gangue, 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 spoil. But the company's not ready to let it rest, even now. There's more in it, you see. Gold, silver, molybdenum, platinum, and copper, of course. Mostly it's copper. Deposits so diffuse, it's as if they are blown in there with like smoke. Mining used to be uneconomic, but as the world's major deposits of ore and metal are depleted, what used to be uneconomic becomes profitable. The oversized, hefty bags are collection pads. The stuff they want precipitates out onto them, and they just scrape it off. It's a leaching process. Spell it either way, and it comes to the same. They'll go on working the ground until all of this, which used to be a mountain almost 8,000 feet high, is just dust to the wind. What are these big steps coming down to the side of the pit? Benches. They serve as roads for heavy equipment around the pit, but their major purpose is to minimize the earth slides. It doesn't look like it worked very well back there. David hooked a thumb over his shoulder. Up here either. They were nearing another area where the look of vast stars descending into the earth was obliterated by a tilted range of crumbled rock. There's a slope failure. The Viet Cong lookout swooped above the slide area. Beyond it, David saw networks of black stuff that at first looked like cobwebs. As they drew nearer, he saw that the strands of what looked like cobwebbing was actually PVC pipe. Just lately, it's been a switchover from rainbirds to emitters. The guide spoke in a tone of one who recites rather than speaks. David had a moment of déjà vu, then realized why. The man was repeating what Audrey Weiler had already said. A few eagles died. A few? David asked, giving Mr. Billingsley's line. All right, about 40 in all. No big deal in terms of the species. There's no shortage of eagles in Nevada. Do you see what they replaced the rainbirds with, David? The big pipes are distribution hands? Cantocks, they say. Big gods. Okay. Yes, and those little hollow cords that stretch between them like mesh, those are emitters, cantas. They drip weak sulfuric acid. It frees the ore, and the rot and rots the ground. Hang on, David. The Viet Cong lookout banked, also like a flying carpet, with David holding onto the edge of the boards to keep from tumbling off. He didn't want to fall onto a terrible gouged ground where nothing grew. Streams of blackish fluid flowed down to the plastic collection pods. Ew. They sank into the pit again and passed above the rusty quinset with the stove stack, the powder magazine, and the cluster of machinery where the road ended. Up the slope, above the gaping hole, there was a wide area poked with other. What? Pocked with other much smaller holes. David thought there had been 50 of them at least, probably more, from each poked a yellow-tipped stick. Looks like the world's biggest gopher colony. This is the blast face, and those are blast holes. He knew acquaintance lectures. The act of mining is going on right here. Each of these holes is 3 feet in diameter and about 30 feet deep. When they're getting ready to shoot, you lower a stick of dynamite into with the blast cap on it at the bottom of each hole. That's the igniter. Then you pour in a couple of wheelbarrows worth of ANFO, stands for ammunition, nitrate, and fossil fuel. These assholes who blew up the Federation building in Oklahoma City and the ANFO, it usually comes in pellets that look like white BBs. Ooh. The man in the Yankees cap pointed to the powder magazine. Lots of ANFO in there, no dynamic. They used up the last on the day all this started to happen, but plenty of ANFO. I don't understand why you're telling me this. Never mind, just listen. Do you see the blast holes? Yes. They're like eyes. That's right. Holes with like eyes. They're sunk into the porphyry, which is crystallized, or crystalline. When the ANFO is detonated, it shatters the rock, and the shattered stuff becomes the ore. Get it? Yes, I think so. That material is trucked away to the leach pads. Leach pads. The distribution heads and emitters, can't talk, are laid over it, and the rotting process begins. Voila. There you have it. Leach ore mining at its very finest. Do you see that the last blast pattern uncovered, David? He pointed to the big hole, and David felt an unpleasant, debilitating coldness begin to creep through him. The hole seemed to stare right up at him with a kind of idiot invitation. What is it? He whispered. But he supposed he knew. Rattlesnake number 1, also known as the China Mine, or the China Shaft, or the China Drift. The last series of shots uncovered it. To say the crew was surprised would be an understatement, because nobody in the Nevada mining business really believes that old story. By the turn of the century, the Diablo Company was claiming that number 1 was simply shut down when the vein played out. It's been here, David. But it's been here, David, all along, and now. Is it haunted? David asked, shivering. It is, isn't it? Oh, yes, the man said in the Yankees cap. The man in the Yankees cap said, turning his silvery no eyes on David. Yes, indeed. Whatever you brought me up here for, I don't want to hear it, David cried. I want you to take me back to my dad. I hate this. I hate being in the land of... He broke off as a horrible thought struck him. The land of the dead. That was the name the man had said. He'd called David an exception, but that meant Reverend Martin. I saw him on the way to the woods. The man looked briefly down at his old-fashioned radio, then looked back up again and nodded. 2 days after you left. David, was he drunk? Toward the end, he was always drunk, like Billingsley. Was it suicide? No, the man in the Yankees cap said. Put on a kindly hand on the back of David's neck. It was warm, not the hand of a dead person. At least, not conscious suicide. He and his wife went to the beach. They took a picnic. He went in the water too soon after lunch and swam too far out. Take me back, David whispered. I'm tired of all this death. That poisoned field is an affront to God, the man said. I know it's a bummer, David, but then let God clean it up, David cried. It's not fair for him to come to me after he killed my mother and my sister. He didn't. I don't care. Even if he didn't, he stood aside and let it happen. That's not true either. David shut his eyes and clapped his hands over his ears. He didn't want to hear any more. He refused to hear any more. Yet the man's voice came through anyway. It was relentless. It was relentless. He would be able to escape it no more than Jonah had been able to escape God. God was relentless as a bloodhound on a fresh scent, and God was cruel. Why are you on earth? The voice seemed to come from inside his head now. I don't hear you. I don't hear you. You are put on earth to love God. No, and serve him. No, fuck God. Fuck this love. Fuck this service. Fuck his service. Fuck his love. That's what he said. God can't make you do anything you don't want to. Stop it. I won't listen. I won't decide. Do you hear me? Do you? Shh. Listen. David quit against his will. David listened. And we got through it. That was a little heavy for me. Beginning was anyway. We had a very long read, but then again, I had to get a couple times, so I'm going to let that process with everybody. I'm also going to make sure God knows I was just reading a book. As much as I know a lot of people will feel the same way as David when something happens to their loved one, it is part of life, and unfortunately, sometimes death is also a part of life, and it always is, but it's not always kind. Somebody once said that there's this woman that says that she can talk to the other side, and that she's been to, heaven talking to God and others, and apparently we're reincarnated, and when we decide to come down, when we pick where we're going, we pick our birth, but we also pick our death. And they're like, she's like, one time she said, there was somebody that said, I want to die by a train accident. I ain't done that yet. Seriously? That's what you decided, a train accident? Like, I wouldn't want to die that way. But if you're reincarnated and you're going over and over and you want to live different deaths, you want to live different lives, it kind of makes sense. I want to be rich. I want to be poor. I want to be in between. I want to, get a degree, but I have a degree and not be able to use it. I want, to have this perfect life, and I want to please everybody, but I can't do that because you can't please everybody, and you can't, live your life this way and this way. And it just doesn't make any sense that you would pick the life you have and the death that makes no sense like that. So, is David going to come back from the land of the dead? He is now over at the China Pit where Talk and Mary are. Sorry, I yawned. So yeah, there's so many conversations we could have after every single reading, but I'm the only one to talk, so yeah, I think that was an interesting one. Audrey's dead. We don't know where what Mary's doing. We know Johnny and Steve went to look for Mary, and they didn't find her, but they know where she might have gone. We know that Ralph is with Cynthia and David is in the land of the dead. Will he come out of it? His eyes moving is a good sign. So, we shall wait and see. We shall try tonight to see if we can read. That is part 20. And we have 6 more parts, just so y'all know. 6 more parts. We are going on to part 4, which has 5 chapters, and then part 5 is the last one. So, we're almost done with our book. That's going to be sad, but it's a good book. So, hopefully y'all enjoyed today's read. I know I started messing up toward the end. I don't know why, but now I'm yawning. Anyway, I want to thank you guys for following me. Thank you for watching. Thank you for sticking with me while watching. Thank you for, putting up with my mess ups and everything. I really appreciate it. We would have done 20 last night, but Twitch was not letting me. So I'm really, really, really glad we got through this. I really am. So, just a side note, I would like sometime to have a guest star on my page. I have done Famix, which is my son. So I think it would be interesting to do somebody that is camera and have a little interview session, which would be kind of cool. So we'll see how that goes and whether or not I can. Yeah. So y'all have a good day. Let's hope that I can see you tonight. Shall we? All right. Y'all have a good day. Love you. Bye.